I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Edge of Tomorrow, but it's actually a really cool movie. One of the things, or the main theme of the movie, is this fella played by Tom Cruise, and he relives the same day over and over again. And every time, and it's a little bit bleak because he dies, and then he wakes up and relives the same day. And he's in a war, and he's battling aliens. And it's sort of like a puzzle, right? He gets a little bit further every time. And then he dies and has to figure it out and go through. So it's a little bit like a cycle. And the oil industry is obviously cyclical, so there's some parallels there. I'm going to start with price. This is always something that everybody's interested in. And the theme here is, we've been here before. So you're looking at gas price and you're looking at oil price. So we started with the shale gas boom, which came as a result of a pent-up demand or supply gap, whatever you want to call it, that the industry eventually fueled and fed by this huge explosion in horizontal drilling technology, and the shale gas boom was born. And then, of course, we had the shale oil boom. And you could argue that we worked ourselves into low prices by doing that. Of course, the industry was highly successful at creating a huge amount of hydrocarbons, oil and gas. But did we convert oil into money or money into oil? Which one are we trying to do here? So there are these cycles. We have to live with them in oil and gas. We don't have a choice. But it's an interesting theme that we sort of keep doing the same thing over and over again. Let's look at the production. And I'm going to focus on U.S. Domestic production. You guys have all seen this chart. But when I look at it, I'm always astounded that the U.S. was able to double domestic production from 5 to 10 million barrels a day in just a few years, right? In just a period of about 5 years. So the shale oil boom in the U.S. was actually quite amazing. And it doesn't. What you got to think about when you're looking at this is not just the additional production that you're creating. You're also covering the declining conventional production. The peak production in the U.S. was something like in the early 1980s, and it's been declining ever since. And so the shale boom not only filled that decline gap, but also increased production. So it's actually quite an accomplishment. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about drilling and completion trends over the last 10 years. This information comes from IHS. And so overall, when we talk about just drilling, probably the single most important trend that led to this increased production that in the U.S. and Canada that we've enjoyed is drilling efficiency. Just the ability, and that's the green line on this plot. So just the ability to put more horizontal feet, meters, whatever you want to call it, of pipe in the ground faster per day. That's more than doubled in the last 10 years. In terms of well construction itself, lateral lengths have increased from 2,500 feet to 7,000 feet. You guys are going to notice that I'm going to switch between talking feet and meters and PSI and KPA. As a Canadian, of course, we have to do that when we're talking the lower 48. All the statistics come in imperial. When we're in Canada, everything's coming in metric. So average lateral lengths, dramatic increase. Average stage counts have increased from 5 to 25. Proppant loads, this is where it's really quite frightening in a way. The sheer amount of treatment intensity over the past 10 years has gone, if you're talking total proppant loads from 200,000 to about 7 million pounds. We're routinely doing 10 million plus pounds of treatment on wells these days. And so if you look at it from a treatment intensity perspective, we've gone from about 80 pounds per foot to 1,000 pounds per foot, which is quite an accomplishment, just purely in the logistics of making that happen. The real question is with all this stuff is how does that translate into performance? How does that, and we're going to look at that. When we look at north of the border here in Canada, these statistics are confined to the Montney, but that's where a lot of our focus and activity is here in Western Canada. So if we look at completed well length, and this is where I switch over to meters, in feet, those statistics are very similar to the U.S. So 2,100 meters is about 7,000 feet or something like that. And so it's trending up. Frac stages, same thing, average of 10 in 2010 to about 25 now. And proppant placed 750 tons to 2,500 tons in terms of total proppant load. That's the global oil market collapse in 2014. The interesting thing is you don't really see any sign of this industry in terms of our ability to make big wells and our willingness to make big wells slowing down at all. Okay? It's just sort of continuing to grow, which is a good thing. So how far will these trends continue to go? That's a question that we get asked quite a lot on my team and also the NCS guys, is how big are these completions going to get? How big should they get? You know, when does it stop becoming economic to stretch that horizontal well out further or put that extra ton of proppant in the ground? I can tell you certainly from the perspective of what we're capable of doing, we haven't even come close to reaching that limit yet in terms of the averages. Eclipse drilled their Purple Haze well, I think earlier this year or last year, I can't remember, but it was 18,000 feet plus. Okay? So that's, in terms of capability, we can make these enormous wells, right? That's nowhere near what the average is right now. That's quite a bit further. In terms of sheer treatment size and intensity, Devon just drilled a well where they pumped 54 million pounds of frac sand in a horizontal well at an intensity of 5,000 pounds per lateral. So in terms of sheer well construction and treatment intensity, we're flexing our muscles there, right, as an industry. We can make this happen already. But you know, are we optimizing or perhaps overcapitalizing is one thing we might want to ask ourselves. So this, you know, these wells, I think, have a purpose in showing us as an industry what we're capable of doing, and they'll undoubtedly teach us some things, but it doesn't necessarily mean we should be drilling all our wells that way. Let's take a look specifically at the Montney. I'm going to do a little bit of a close-up look. And my good friend Lucas Ford at Verdazo helped me prepare some of these plots, and so thank you, Lucas, for that. We spent probably a couple hours on the phone looking at the details of this and trying to figure out what it all means. But I like these plots because it's sort of a simple way to look at statistics, right? And please take it, I'm going to say this a couple times in the presentation, take it with a grain of salt. If you guys saw the first presentation I gave, I talked a lot about the fallacy of data statistics. So just be careful. This is a blunt instrument. These are just averages that we're looking at. So this is all the Montney, but the nice thing about it is there's 1849 wells in here. Okay, so there's almost 2,000 wells. We can really get a sense of the average trends. And so what I want to do is I want to look at three different statistics that I think are very important. One of them is well length, one is stage count, and one is proppant intensity or treatment intensity. So we're going to look at well length first, I think. Yeah, we're going to look at well length first of all. And what we're plotting here, these are cum distributions, and what we're plotting here is 6-month gas produced per 100 meters well length. And if you guys recall in my first presentation, you know, it's a metric of just gas cum produced is not necessarily the best metric to say how a well is going to ultimately perform, but it's a pretty good metric, and it's the best we've got in terms of public data. So let's use that. And I wanted to use 6 months because, as opposed to 12 months, because I wanted to include wells that are recently drilled. So we wanted to, you know, use as recent data as we possibly could. So what you're looking at here is these various different binnings that you're seeing here are different horizontal well lengths. And we're reporting the 6-month cum per 100 meters of length. So what this shows us is there's somewhat of a tipping point or peak performance at around 1,500. That's the curve shown in yellow. And when the horizontal wells get longer than that, those curves start to move back on themselves in terms of gas produced per 100 meters of well length. So I hope that's clear. What that's really showing you, at least in terms of the averages, is that there is a place where you start to become less efficient. And that would be fully expected, right? As we're drilling these wells out longer, you're not going to get a fully scalable result. You're going to start to lose efficiencies. I want to look at the same information now in terms of cost, because in Canada we get a pretty good cost database available to us that we can add in there as well. But again, just, you know, the caveat here is we're dealing with public data. It's not perfect data source, but at least gives us an idea of the trends. if we look at it in terms of cost, we can actually push that envelope further. So that's telling us that we can get to about 2,500 meters, even though we're losing efficiencies purely in terms of per meter gas produced. In terms of cost, we can actually start drilling those out further, and on the average anyways, we're still getting good cost effectiveness. So sorry, I got ahead of myself and didn't explain what we're plotting here. This is 6-month gas cum plotted per $1,000 of CapEx. Okay? So now that you get the idea of what we're doing there, let's look at the same type of plots now for the two other variables that we're interested in. One is stage spacing. Okay, that's what we're going to look at now, and then we'll do treatment intensity after that. So this is stage spacing. In this plot, the green curve, as you would expect, is the lowest stage spacing or the highest stage density, however you want to look at it. And the gray curve at the back is the largest or least dense stage spacing. So this is exactly what you would expect. You'd expect the average performance to go up as the spacing starts to decrease. So there's no surprises there. What about in terms of cost? So how cost effective is denser spacing? Well, as expected, these curves start to collapse in on each other, and what we actually see is right around 75 to 150. We really don't, as we get less than 75 meters, we don't see any improvement in cost effectiveness. So I see that a little bit as a limitation in our technology. We need to drive the technology to the point where we can start doing denser spacing at a lower cost, because we will get the performance out of the wells, at least on the average. Again, you have to look at this in terms of specific areas. This is all of the Montney, and we don't want to treat it with, paint it with all the same brush. But at least in terms of the averages, that's what it seems to show us. Let's look at how scalable well performance is to treatment size, so sheer proppant volume. As we would expect here, there's a trend as we move towards the right, the treatment intensity increases. So what we're plotting here is tons of proppant pumped per 100 meters of well length. So it's a treatment intensity figure or density figure. The interesting thing about this one, and this may just be unique to the area that we're looking at, is for some reason when we get into the really high intensity treatments, 150 to 200 tons per 100 meters, and it's hard to see it on this plot, but there are 130 samples in that bin, and they're actually among the worst producers. And so that's a big question mark. Why did that happen, right? It seems to peak at 100 to 150 tons, and then we actually see, on average, a loss in productivity observed for treatments that are larger than that. So I sort of scratched my head a little bit on that one. Lucas and I talked a bit about that, and what we found, and it doesn't show up on here, but all of these gray wells were clustered in one particular spot. So that's a geology thing, I think, more than anything. It's probably an area of the Montney where they weren't getting the performance maybe that they wanted, so they were trying larger treatment sizes and maybe not getting the result that we're seeing in some of the more successful areas. So in general, I think it tells us the story that we would expect to see. In terms of cost effectiveness for treatment intensity, what we see here is it maxes out basically at about 50 to 100 tons per 100 meters, and that's where we're getting approximately 170 MCF per $1,000 of CapEx spent. So cost effectiveness of horizontal completions appears to diminish beyond 100 tons. Again, there may be some false data in there or some hidden variables simply because we're mixing geologies, right? We're not doing this on a consistent geological basis, and there may be a grouping of wells in here that just don't perform as well. In any case, that settles out to about 670 or close to 700 pounds per foot in terms of treatment intensity. So again, conclusions served with caveats. Take this with a grain of, not because Montney's a siltstone, grain of silt. We're looking at large geologically diverse data sets. We're using an imperfect metric, 6-month GP, to measure performance, and we're relying on imperfect data. If you can sort of sit with those assumptions, we can actually pull some decent conclusions out of this, at least on the average, and we have to treat it as an average. Cost effectiveness of wellbore length starts to diminish beyond about 2,500 meters or 8,200 feet. So I didn't have a good answer to this question before. Now going through the exercise of looking at this data, I have a pretty good answer, at least in the Montney, in terms of averages, where we start to have that tipping point. There's room to increase stage density in the Montney, but cost efficiencies need to improve. I think this is an area where completion technology can really help us. Cost effectiveness of treatment intensity starts to diminish at about the 1 ton per meter mark, which is about 700 pounds per foot. That's the Montney. Devon did their 5,000 pounds per foot well in the stack. So there's a huge gap there, right? So does that mean we shouldn't be increasing treatment intensity beyond that? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means on the average. There is some decent perm stuff in the Montney that's mixed up with the low perm stuff, and we're sort of lumping it all together. So that's the Montney. What about the lower 48? So let's talk a little bit about the U.S. And we need to talk about the U.S. Because really that's where the bulk of the shale oil revolution has occurred. In fact, if you take the Permian, Eagle Ford, and Bakken, and if you were to sort of pretend that that was a self-governing country out on its own, it would be, with those 3 plays alone, it would be the 5th largest oil producer in the world after China. So that's quite astounding when you look at the statistics on that. So these 3 plays by themselves are responsible for the vast majority of the doubling of U.S. domestic production supply over the last 10 years. What I'm really interested in, so it's obvious that the production is there, okay, but how did we get that production? Did that simply come from just drilling more wells, or did it come from drilling better wells in addition? So the EIA has done some good work in sort of compiling some of these statistics. And what we see, and I like these plots because they show year over year well profiles, average well profiles. And of course we've got to be careful when we're doing averaging with type wells, I understand that. But again, it's just a rough sort of metric to really get a sense for what's going on. And there's a couple things we can see from these plots. One is that every single one of those plays, all 3 of them show year-on-year growth in average production performance. Every one of them do. But they're not all created equal. For example, in the Eagle Ford and Bakken, what you see if you look carefully is that you're starting to see diminishing returns. The improvement is there, but it's getting less and less per year. And eventually what you're going to see, and it's happening already in plays like the Eagle Ford, is these curves will start crossing each other. The reason is the Eagle Ford and Bakken are somewhat mature plays, and wells that are being drilled now are infill locations in many cases. And so you're starting to see a dropping in performance. And certainly you can see it in the overall production in those plays. They're starting to decline already. What's happening in the Permian is a little bit different. The Permian is still displaying growth that looks scalable, right? It looks like it's still in full sort of development mode, and that seems to be the case, and that's why the Permian is a hot area right now. There's many different plays and subbasins in there, and a lot of exploration, a lot of areas where the land hasn't even been locked up yet, and companies are still really going gangbusters and drilling in there. So that's really what the landscape looks like in the U.S. Of course, there are many other plays that I'm not covering here. These are the ones that, just from the pure numbers and statistics, these are the ones that are of the most interest. But of course, there's many other ones that we can look at. What about costs in the U.S.? This comes from IHS. If we look at all the different plays, again, what I'm more interested in here is the overall trend. I was surprised when I saw this chart because what it really shows is that D&C costs, at least in the lower 48, have been declining since 2012. So even long before the collapse of the global oil market, we started seeing these costs coming down. And in fact, we're at a cost efficiency point right now that's the same as where we were 10 years ago. So that's great, right? We've brought the costs down. It's good news. Let's continue this sort of talk about economics. And this is specific to Texas, but I really like this plot. One of the reasons I like this is because it teaches you that this whole averaging thing that I'm doing can be dangerous. Okay? What you're seeing here, these bars are all broken down. Every one of those bars represents a county in Texas. And the color coding represents different shale plays that we know. For example, the pink one is Wolfcamp. So let's look at Wolfcamp. And what we're measuring here is break even per BOE. So in the Wolfcamp, we range all the way from $23 break even all the way to the maximum, which is $59. So even when you're within a play, counties that are comprising that play can have vastly different economics. And that's because you've got different operators working in there, you've got different geology. There's a huge amount of texture when we get into the real nitty-gritty of the details. And so the break-even prices are all over the map, okay, and ranging everywhere from the low 20s all the way up to 60 and higher. Let's expand the view. So that was sort of a down-in-the-weeds view. Let's expand the view and look more in terms of the whole North American picture. And so these are break-evens for plays across the board, and we've got Canada and the US in there. And a couple things I want to show. One is that Canadian plays are competitive. That's great news. The dark dots that you're seeing in here are break-even prices for Canadian plays. Bad news is they're not necessarily economic across the board, right? This is as of November 22nd. We were at $50 US WTI, and some of these assets are doing well, but there's a huge majority of them, especially in the lower 48, that are they're not economic at these prices, right? So we, as an industry, and we'll get to that theme later on, we need to obviously do something about that. Okay, so I've spouted a lot of statistics. I've talked about increases, production increases. I've talked a little bit about some trends that I think are driving performance from a very broad basis. What made all this possible? And I think I spent some time talking to some of the folks that are back at our office and some operators as well, to get everybody's opinion on this and try to get a good sense of what have been the technological game changers that have taken us to where we are now. Because if we can understand that, then maybe we can understand what's going to drive us in the future. And what I'm going to say here, agree with it if you like or not, is that the game changers up until now have been decidedly low-tech. Okay? Really simple things, but really powerful things. For example, pad drilling. There are some high-tech elements of that, obviously, but pad drilling is probably the single most important economy of scale tool that we've harnessed as an industry that's allowed us to get to where we are now in terms of the vast amount of production increase that we've enjoyed. Scalable, efficient placement of pipe in the ground, it lowers capital cost per foot or per meter of well drilled. Multi-stage completions is the second one. Without multi-stage completions, we wouldn't have any of this, because we simply wouldn't have been able to make any of these wells produce the way we have and make them economic. So multi-stage completions has allowed us to execute compartmentalized stimulation. And I'm going to carry on with that theme. You're going to see that later on. We'll talk about being able to compartmentalize a stimulation. And that, of course, lowers cost and increases production. So we get a double value there. And then, of course, slick water fracturing. Again, decidedly low-tech in many ways. We went as an industry to spending billions of dollars on things like gel breakers and additives to frac fluid, and now we're back at the point where we're just using slick water. In fact, I heard yesterday that there's operators in some places that aren't even putting friction reducers in their frac fluid anymore. They're just going back to produced effluent and pumping that as frac fluid. So what does that really mean? Does it mean we don't need all these technologies? No, it just means a lot of times the simplest answer is the best answer. And slick water fracturing seems to have really taken on as a tool to, as a vehicle to produce these massive hydraulic fracture stimulations that that have made these big wells. So those are really the three technologies that I think have been critical in getting us to where we are. So that's where we are now.